right, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Marie Price, professor at George Washington University. Marie and her panel are going to speak about the geographic implications of migration, immigration, and resettlement. Marie?
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here in the city of New York, the ultimate immigrant gateway. And so today, the inspiration for today's panel was to turn our focus on how immigrants and migrants, but mostly immigrants, are changing cities in the world. And we're going to start with Nisha Agrawal, who is the commissioner from the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, someone from the policy world who deals with the day-to-day concerns of having a large number of immigrants in the urban setting. And then we have Dr. Audrey Singer, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, an immigration scholar, and she will talk about immigrant integration in U.S. metropolitan areas, expanding to the view from the nationally. She'll be followed by Dr. David Rain from George Washington University, who spent many years looking at mobility and migration in the African context. He spent 2 years in Niger in the Peace Corps and also has ongoing work in Accra, Ghana. And he'll give a perspective from sub-Saharan Africa, not just immigration, but how migration is changing cities. And then I will end with a brief presentation on where I think the world's global immigrant gateways, cities with over 1 million people, will be in 2050, over 1 million immigrants, that is. So we will each speak for about 7 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time for everyone in the room who's interested to ask questions of the panel. Thank you very much. Nisha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price and the Geographical Society, for having me here this morning. I was saying I don't often get a chance to talk to a crowd like this, so really excited to share with you some of the work we've been doing at the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, or MOIA, we are essentially a bridge between City Hall and New York City's many diverse immigrant communities. We were voted into the charter for New York City in 2001, but we actually started in a much smaller form as a division of the Department of City Planning back in 1986. So it's an office that's been around for a while. We're the first city in the country to actually have a charter-mandated Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And here you'll see our mission, which is really simply to promote the well-being of immigrant families in New York City. And so that really gives us wide berth to do a number of different programs and policies and advise the mayor on issues affecting migrants in New York City. Our 3 goals in this administration really, for one, support the Mayor de Blasio's larger agenda around challenging inequalities in New York City. Our sort of 3 pillars of work. The first is simply to think about programs and work on programs that promote immigrant integration, a range of different ways in which immigrants sometimes face barriers in accessing city services and moving through the city effectively and sort of really thriving. And so our office tries to think about ways to limit and remove those barriers. And I'll talk about some examples of those. The second big bucket is around access to justice. So being an immigrant in the United States, whether authorized or unauthorized, the law often determines kind of your relationship to how you exist within the city. And the lack of access to legal counsel and quality legal information very significantly impacts immigrant families. And so we have a number of different projects to think about how to support access to justice for immigrants in New York City. And then finally, the very nature of immigration in the US is that so much of the policy is determined at the federal level and to some extent also at the state level. And so we do advocacy with sister cities around the country to lift up the voice of cities and our concern with and interest in immigration issues and do some advocacy around this, around the country. And we use a range of different strategies, from policy to education and outreach, advocacy and communications, to really move forward in each of these 3 pillars of work. Here are some examples of the types of projects that we have in each of the pillars of work. I will dive into a few of these in more detail in a minute, but it gives you a sense of the range on immigrant integration, things like addressing language barriers and eliminating them, working with our fellow agencies to ensure they provide interpretation and translation. Thinking through immigration fraud, it's an astoundingly huge problem in a city like New York, where immigrants will go to the local notario or fraudulent provider, spend thousands of dollars, and either get very poor quality service or no service at all, and suddenly they've lost thousands of dollars. So really thinking about how to tackle this large but often quite elusive problem to solve. And then finally, here are a couple of the coalitions that we work with nationally that we helped to create in the last year, both on citizenship as well as advocating for immigration reform federally. To give you some context of what we're talking about in New York City, about 37% of New York City's population of just over 8 million are foreign-born New Yorkers. So that's more than 3 million people. We have more immigrants in New York City than there are people in Chicago. So it's a pretty significant population. Once you add the children of those immigrants, it's 60% of the city. And a few other facts to throw out at you: more than half of our families in New York City speak a language other than English at home. A quarter are limited English proficient, and that means that they don't speak, read, understand English well enough to interact in health settings with city agencies, that there are those language barriers that exist and are significant for those families. And finally, we estimate that somewhere between 500,000 to 600,000 New Yorkers are undocumented, and so don't have legal status or have fallen out of legal status to be in the United States. And as you can see, the sort of geography of New York City's migrants is pretty, on the one hand, it's a huge city and a huge geographic footprint, but on the other hand, immigrants tend to be clustered in particular neighborhoods. And so for an office like mine, that's helpful in terms of thinking about doing outreach and where to really build community relationships and community presence. So now to sort of share with you a little bit about the concrete ways in which we attempt to promote the well-being of immigrant families in New York City. One very high-profile program that we launched this year and the mayor has really taken a lead on is the city's new municipal ID program. So unfortunately, currently in New York State, both federal government-issued identification and state government-issued identification, like driver's licenses, are not available to people who are undocumented. So as a result, you have parents who can't pick their kids up at school because they don't have an ID to show the guard at the school. You have individuals who may be involved in riding their bike on the sidewalk and get stopped by a police officer, and because they don't have ID, they actually get brought into the precinct. Very basic ways in which the lack of ID impacts people's lives. And beyond that, New York City is not a city where a lot of people drive. Something like half of the driving age adults in New York City don't have a New York State driver's license. So this issue of identification really jumped out for the mayor as a barrier, not just for immigrants, but really across the board, and the feeling that with ID, New Yorkers are better off, and New York City as a city is safer. And so this was one of the top priorities that the mayor announced as part of his platform when he took office 2 years ago. And what's been pretty remarkable about pulling this program together, we were sort of balancing two interests. One was to make sure we reach this particularly vulnerable population of the undocumented, who historically have been resistant to interacting with government for a lot of the obvious reasons that you can imagine, but also who have a huge need for this kind of program. We also didn't want to create an ID card that only the undocumented would use. And essentially it becomes a sort of stigmatizing program to say that this is the card, by showing the card, you are essentially showing that you are undocumented. So what we did was design an ID card that really appeals to all New Yorkers. And we created something that looks a lot like a driver's license, so it has the security features and the kind of credibility of government-issued ID. It also has a number of benefits that your driver's license does not have. As an example, we have built into it prescription drug discounts. You can list emergency contact and preferred language. You can use it as your library card. And you can also use it to get free memberships for a year at 33 of the city's top cultural institutions. Places like Lincoln Center, the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, large and small sort of gems of New York's cultural world are part of this ID card. So as a result of sort of the wide range of benefits and features of the card, the demand for it when we launched the program on January 12th, and the response in New York City was pretty phenomenal. In less than a year, we have more than 600,000 people who have signed up for the card. And what's been particularly remarkable is the mix of people. So if you map out where the enrollments have been, you see, of course, huge numbers in immigrant neighborhoods like Corona, Queens. In fact, in Corona, 1 out of 5 people has an ID-NYC card. That's, for us, a huge victory from the perspective of really reaching immigrant families who are our target population. But we also know that lots of other New Yorkers have their ID-NYC, and so we were able to destigmatize a program that could have had some negative effects if not done properly. And I think this is an example of how a large city like New York can think about immigrant inclusion and immigrant integration. When you have this challenge that's really imposed by a government at other levels, right, the inability to get identification, what does a city do to respond, and how can you structure it in such a way that you're addressing the needs of immigrant families but also making a program that's more broadly appealing? I will mention that we also have a healthcare program that we're launching right now, and maybe in the Q&A or discussion I can talk about it a little bit more. A couple of other things to flag. On access to justice, one of the big challenges that New York City faces, or one of the big issues that New York City faces, is that we have 700,000 people who tomorrow could apply to become US citizens but haven't done so. And there are a wide variety of reasons for that, some of which are cost, lack of access to quality legal services, and we've really been thinking about both how do we build services and embed them in the urban institutions that families are using, places like libraries, but how do we also scale our outreach? So one of the things we did recently and learned recently by looking at the data the city holds itself, that half of those 700,000 people have some relationship to a city agency. We have contact with them already. So one of the things we've really been grappling with is how does government communicate with and relate to people who are already interacting with us about programs and services that could really benefit them down the line, and citizenship is one area where we've really been exploring some of those questions. And then finally, I will just say on national advocacy, I'm sure many of you have been following and hearing that the national climate on immigration right now is really toxic. And in a city like New York, where really across political spectrums, the emphasis has been on inclusion of immigrants, it was, in Mayor de Blasio's opinion, important that we get together with sister cities around the country and advocate for changes at the federal level, both in terms of the narrative dialogue right now, but more in terms of the laws and programs that we see coming down from the federal level. So this coalition, Cities United for Immigration Action, has been around for less than a year, and we have been working to both disseminate best practices. About 24 cities around the country came to New York to talk about municipal ID programs, for example, but we've also been advocating on some of the sorts of issues that you hear about in the news these days, including the refugee crisis. And so it continues to be an infrastructure that cities are using to come together and be able to tell their story at the national level. And I will stop there and leave my contact information in case you'd like to be in touch in the future. Thank you.